Okay, so hi everyone. My name's Charlie Hume. I'm creative director with Donor Voice, and I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Dr. Kiki Koutmeridou, who is the chief behavioral scientist here. Thanks for everyone for joining today. Thanks for everyone whose patients we've tested by being part of this series. Today's session is going to be on testing itself, and anyone who's followed the agitator for any period of time, anyone who read yesterday's post, knows that we've been on a quest for a long time as a sector to get a better understanding of what testing is and what testing isn't, because it's a sad reality that we are spending and losing a huge amount of money and time and effort and opportunity cost on tests that by any scientific measure just aren't tests. So we're going to briefly cover the do's and the don'ts of that, and then move past that to show you how you can scientifically simultaneously conduct thousands of tests to get to solid empirical answers. So we'll spend the next half an hour or so giving you what we hope is a thorough grounding in the do's and don'ts of testing, and then showing a better way to test going forward. So I'm going to start with a case study. So this is a classic example of why, sadly, most tests fail, and it isn't because we don't employ smart people, and it isn't because we don't spend a lot of time and effort and money, and it isn't because we don't have great ideas. It's because we're missing, well, there's a few things, but in this case, we're missing a fundamental ingredient. So this was a test that was done, which anyone who's going to be familiar with this challenge in fundraising, especially when you're looking in the early days, is retention rates, especially with acquisition. We know that we spend a huge amount of money recruiting people, only to lose a huge amount of them in the first year. So this test was designed for, how do we stop the bleeding? We know this is happening. We know it's happened, continually. How are we going to stop it? And so, drawing on all fundraising best practice, the idea was, well, we know that, in theory, we should be saying thank you a lot. We know that we should be showing impact. We know, we should be sending these kind of quote unquote engagement touch points. In other words, communications that don't ask for money, but just show the supporter, that we respect them, that we value them, that we're grateful for them, and the difference they're making. Okay. So we knew that we could, should, and I'm saying, putting these words in inverted commas, do that. The question was, well, how often do we do that? We've only got so many levers that we can pull here, and one of the, the levers that we pull most often is frequency. Is more better, is less better? We don't know. So the test was, look, in every month, people so far in the control journey are getting one of these communications. Okay, every month they're going to get a communication that says, thank you, you're amazing, we really value you, you're making a huge difference. The two test conditions were, what if we increase that by another 6 communications? And what if we increase that by another 12 communications? Now, if we were in a room together, I'd ask for a show of hands, but we're all online. But just in your own mind, answer that question for yourself. We're all experienced fundraisers here. What do we think is the optimum frequency to improve retention rate in year one? Was it monthly? Was it monthly plus 6? Was it monthly plus 12? If we look in the first column, the actual answer was, didn't make the slightest bit of difference what we did. You can see here we've got a control, which was the norm, the light, which is where we've added 6 extra touches, the heavy, we've actually 12 extra touches. But the retention rate was, although it's dipped ever so slightly, when we've got 1 point drop when we look at the light touch, it's the same whether it's this control or we've doubled it in the heavy. Okay. In other words, that test, either that's true and that's really what's going on, or the test was set up incorrectly. I'm not sure how well this is rendering on the screen here, but in these little columns you can see different people representing our supporters. You've got blue people, green people, red people, orange people. Imagine those colors represented different reasons for supporting, whether that was strength of relationship or, which in this case it is, it's the strength of relationship. Okay. But you see that these are not, these are spread horizontally across these bars. They don't go vertically. In other words, within the heavy group, you've got people with stronger or weaker relationship strength. In the light group, stronger and weaker relationship strength. In the control, stronger and weaker. So they're scattered throughout them. And so they're kind of cancelling each other out, and we're ending up with this fake news, nothing has changed. If we look at the second column now, and now we're looking at the people who are, as they walk through the door, they were high commitment. I think if you've attended some of our earlier sessions, we've already talked about commitment as a measurement of relationship strength. Okay, so commitment means their strength of relationship with your brand. Okay, in this case, these people, the first thing you see is retention rate is way up. Okay, so within the cohort that were already high commitment when they walked through the door, but we've got something that's counterintuitive is going on here, that the more communications we're sending to our most committed people, the less likely they are to stick around. Okay, so we've gone from the control at an 88% retention rate. When we've sent a few more comms, we've dropped 5 points. When we've doubled the amount of communications, we've gone down 9 points. So we're now seeing a 9-point decrease in retention rate from our active going about trying to increase retention. Okay, but if we take the flip side of that, we look at our people who lower commitment. Now, this doesn't mean to say they dislike, it just means like any other relationship, they're in their earlier days. It's a weaker relationship. The higher commitment people may have some kind of connection, maybe some kind of understanding with the brand. Lower commitment people, again, early stage of the relationship, not so much. Now we're seeing, the other side of the coin, that we're actually seeing a 12-point increase on retention rate when we send them a little more. So the control here stays the same as the control in the original condition. When we double, we've gone up 4 points. When we go up a little, we've gone up by 12 points. Okay, now this is not by way of saying to you that there's a magic number on volume. That's not the point of showing you this test. The point of showing this test is we need to know who our audience is, because as we can see, if we look in the first grouping on the left-hand side, nothing changes if we assume that everyone that we're sending our test to is effectively the same person. Okay, we would never say that in a million years. We would never think that in a million years, but yet the way we've set our tests up is exactly that. Everyone is the same. Okay, but yet when we look at them through a different lens, we have an understanding of a different relationship with the brand. We have an understanding of where they sit in relationship to us. Something very, very different is going on. Okay, so this test failed just because we didn't know enough about our audience. Okay, now if you've been following this series already, and you've sat through talks that Kiki's already done and Stefano's already done, then you've already kind of heard about the way people are different in ways that matter. I mean, common sense dictates that our audience are made up of people, and common sense dictates that people are different. Okay, but they're also different in ways that can be measured and can be managed to significantly improve supporter experience and value. But when we look over tests we've all been part of, I've certainly been part of these kind of tests, and I'm sure probably all of us would plead guilty, but innocent of knowing we were guilty. How many of these tests were ever set up knowing anything meaningful about the people we were sending this test to? And by meaningful, I'm saying we're defining that as an understanding of who this audience is in relationship to you. Okay, we have as a sector tons of information on our audience, but they're almost, invariably it's descriptive information. We know that they're cash donors, they're monthly donors, they're lapsed donors, they're donors who maybe also take part in advocacy. We've got groupings based on recency, frequency, value. We've got demographics, we've got psychographics. And if we segment our test results after the fact, looking through these lenses, we're going to see differences, okay? But the same would be true if we analyze our test results by their star sign or their shoe size. I mean, these differences are as inevitable as they are irrelevant, okay? Firstly, because none of those explain why people do what they do. Knowing what someone did is not knowing the same as why they did it, okay? So we've got a lot of descriptive information, nothing that's predictive, okay? Secondly, if our test wasn't designed for any of those groupings beforehand, then these random differences after the fact is just going to be a waste of time and a waste of money. And that goes double for any non-scientific attempts at understanding the why, like personas or pen portraits. So step one of any test is understanding why people do what they do in relationship to you. What are the meaningful differences? Is it something like personality, for example? So if you saw Stefano's personality and he was Stefano's talk about personality, and he was talking about the kind of the measurable and manageable traits that we're all going to broadly fall into one of five personality types: conscientious, openness, and so on, agreeable. We're going to fall into one of these groups, or it might be identity in the way that Kiki's talked about the intrinsic motivation for wanting to support a charity. Is it because you're a health charity and I've experience of that particular disease? Is it because you're a charity that focuses on children? I'm a parent. All these kind of things. Or is it commitment, as we saw in the first example? Is it strength of relationship? All of these are meaningful differences that we can uncover and we can start to look at when we're putting our test together. What you're seeing on the screen here is just a very busy, very jazzy example of a charity who were looking at putting together segments on their base based on personality. Okay, and you can see this matrix rows and columns. You don't need to dive too deeply, but the point is you can see there is a lot of things that could be going on, but the three that are circled in yellow is what actually is going on for this particular group. Okay, so in this case, we're looking at the personality profile of a charity's donor base, and it's giving us details on how to target and message to each group. Okay, the point is that if these differences are unknown, if they're ignored in the test and the analysis we do, then all we're going to have to show for the tests and analysis we do is either random noise or nothing's changed whatsoever. Okay, so let me now show you a test where we're looking at specifically identity. Okay, on the next slide. This was a charity. It's the Make-A-Wish charity, well-known charity looking after kind of kids who are terminally ill. Okay, and you can see there are three test conditions here. Okay, what we've done is based on identity. So on the working from right to left, we've got the standard control ad. Okay, and these are all Facebook social media adverts. When you donate and help grant a wish, you help her fight her illness. Okay. Then we've uncovered for this charity an identity, an intrinsic reason for wanting to support this charity. And in this case, it was people who worked in and around the medical profession. Okay, so we're going to try and touch on that in the test that we do and see if that makes a difference. And we've got two treatments. One where we kind of softly touch on it, which is here. You know the heartache of a child diagnosed with a critical illness, and then the copy is exactly the same. The other where we're going to overtly say it, okay? As a medical professional, you know the heartache, etc. Everything else is identical, but what we've done is just, target and message for those identities. And then when we look at the results, okay, we've now seen a 41% increase in the click-through rate from priming identity. Okay, so the first point about this, just to kind of finish this section off, is we need to understand something about our audience, because when we do, we see serious lift. As we saw in the first example, we saw a serious increase and decrease in retention rates by doing exactly the same thing. In this case, we're being a bit more controlled. We're seeing the click-through rate go up in exactly the direction we would want it to go, because we know something of value about our audience. We tested it, we validated it. The second reason tests often fail is because too often we're testing more than one thing. So in that example, you could see there was only one thing that was being tested. There was only one change. Okay. If we're testing multiple variables, we have no idea. It's a needle in a haystack. Okay. If we don't know why something happened, then we can't use that insight for any other part of the journey. If we're testing multiple variables against each other, then we've got no idea what accounts for the winning test. You can take, we've seen this time and time and time again, and it gets to the point where it becomes, frankly, sad in our position to see this, where you can see two completely different concepts with completely different creatives, completely different messages, the artwork, the taglines, the call to action, and one is put against another, and it's called a test. Okay, the reality is it's not a test. It's a big jumbled mess. If we've tested more than one thing, we haven't done a test. If we haven't accounted for what people for the single variable, then it's not a test. If we haven't accounted for what makes people different in context, it gets even messier, to the point that the only people that these tests actually work for are the agencies we're paying to create them. Okay, so I hope, in a nutshell, that kind of simply summarizes two basic principles. First of all, is we need to know our audience, or it's not going to be a test, and we need to be testing one thing, or it isn't going to be a test. So there's a lot that's going on there, but what Kiki's going to do now is explain how we can get to a place for where, first of all, we know what the one thing to test is. Second of all, that we can know precisely what's the best possible version of that one thing, because there are multiple ways to do that. And the third thing is how we're going to find out if those answers differ based on our audience. Okay, so I hope my part was useful, and I'm going to hand over to my colleague Kiki to take it from here.
Thank you, Charlie. Okay, so we can't test more than one thing at once. However, all your product offers communications consist of multiple things, like the headline, the copy, the imagery, and each of those could have many different versions, which creates an infinity problem. Which version do you test first? Which one do you put into market? How do you test this more effectively? Because if you run a B test, that's going to take you months or even years to test the different versions. Do you invite people over and have a focus group to give you an answer of what's going to be most effective or what people prefer? Yes, you could do that. However, their answers are not going to be valid, not because people lie, but because they don't really understand themselves what drives their choice when it's in the natural environment. And in that setting, when you place a few options before them, yes, they're gonna prefer one and give you a reason. However, they don't account for any subconscious effects that can drive their choice when they actually receive the mail through the post. So what can you do? This methodology that we're going to present to you today is making use of how we make decisions in our everyday life. We don't ask people why they prefer something because we know they can't offer us valid responses, even if they wanted to. But what we do is we give them a choice between a communication letter 1 and letter 2. And we ask them to choose. We don't ask them why. That imitates how people make choices in real life. And also it takes into account the holistic experience, because one option, the preference for one option rather, can change in different contexts. So when you see this image with that context, you might not like it, but when you see it in a different context, you might do. So by using this kind of methodology, we imitate real life and we avoid being biased by people's subjective opinion of why they might prefer something. Okay, but that doesn't really solve the not testing more than one thing. How do we get there? It all starts with what we call a testing grid, and it's essentially a table where each row represents a different attribute that we want to test. You don't need to pay attention to the details of this table. It's an illustration. This exercise was done to try and find the most effective consent wording. So in this case, in our brainstorming session, we wanted to identify the attributes that could affect that behavior, giving consent to be contacted. And each row represents a different behavioral science principle that could increase the desire to be contacted. And each column represents a different execution of that principle, because as we said before, there are many different ways that you can express anything, this concept, behavioral science principle, or images, or whatever it might be. So we have this table here with all of our test ideas, and all of those represent over 5,000 A/B tests if we were to run them in market. But this methodology allows us to very quickly test that in the space of weeks. How? So we have the testing grid with all of our ideas, and then the end result is what you see at the bottom right, where people see two options and they're asked to choose one of them. How do we arrive at that? What the software does is it takes a different combination of cells to create a communication. For example, all the cells marked in red were used to create letter number 1, and all the cells marked in green were used to create letter 2. And now I see letter 1 and letter 2 on my screen, and I make a choice. And then I make another choice. Each responded to this, each person who takes part in this survey, let's call it survey, they see between 7 and 10 choice tasks where they have to select letter 1 or letter 2. And that means that with a very low number of respondents, about 300, you can have enough power to get significant results. And also this way, you only test one item from each row each time, because every screen people see has a different combination of cells from each row. That's why we call that A/B testing on steroids, because you can do this, you can test over 5,000 A/B tests in the space of weeks. So at the end, what you get is all the winning elements of the pretest tool, which is the official name. And you can combine all that to create a communication, or you can condense it down to use it on a landing page, reply form, anywhere where space is limited, or you can pick and choose which elements to use at different contexts. To make sure that this methodology works, we always validate it in market. So from the thousands of from the thousands of ideas that we had and we couldn't test them in market, we now have a few winners and we can test those few winners. So we created the consent communication based on the winning elements from the previous table, and we compared it against the standard consent ask that this client had. And our winning element communication resulted in an 8% higher chance of consent to emails, which was the target for that client. Okay, so we covered how you could test just one option at a time, but also do multiple A/B tests at the same time. But we also mentioned that not everyone is the same, and we should bear in mind who our audience is. So now I'm going to share a case study from another client, a food bank in this case. Again, the details of the testing grid don't matter. What you need to keep in mind is that we had 4 different attributes that we were testing, different versions for each one. And most importantly, after the choice task that we asked people to do, to choose letter 1 or letter 2, we also asked them a few questions to find out who they are and their intrinsic motivation to support this food bank. And more specifically, we asked them if they have kids themselves, if they've worked with kids, and if they have experienced hunger themselves in the past. And you can see here that 63% of respondents have kids, and they have a slightly higher commitment score from people with no kids. We have about 20% of people who worked with kids, again, slightly higher commitment. And people with connection to hunger, 32% of the respondent base. And you can see here that their commitment score is significantly higher to those that had never experienced hunger. All this is important when we analyze the results that we get from the pretest tool. So going back to what we tested, let's start with the bottom row, the insert. At the top left, you can see the original ideas. And at the bottom right, you can see their creative execution. So you have an infographic, a story, a testimonial from a kid, the celebrity testimonial, a menu, and a circular. Results from the pretest tool give us scores. And these scores range from 0 to 100. The higher the score, the higher the preference. And these scores also signal magnitude. So a score of 60 is twice as preferred than a score of 30. And you can see here that the infographic was a clear winner. That's what everyone loved. And in this case, there were no differences between parents, non-parents, people who have experience with hunger, or people who have worked with kids. Going to the second attribute, the treatment of schools, or the header. Again, we have a clear winner which can be used across communications. However, the thing to notice is that when you break down results by people who have experienced hunger, for example, you can see that for that group, the nutrition hub is mostly preferred. So you can start seeing differences at the way you could communicate to these different identity groups based on their motivation to give. The same happened when we looked at the third attribute, the reply form, or the symbolic gift, or what your gift could buy. Again, the details don't matter. We have a winner. But when you look at the results based, again, on people who had experience with hunger, you can see that a different option is the one that is preferred for that identity group. And finally, for the letter message, again, same thing. Overall, when you don't segment or analyze results based on identity, the missing meals is the winning message. However, when you segment results based on experience with working with kids, you see that the most important, the most preferred message is the most important school supply. So overall, from the testing grid, the brainstorm session, to fill in the grids, to the results that you've just seen, it takes 6 weeks. And in the space of those 6 weeks, you can test thousands of ideas that you have for your offer product elements. And that is the end of the session. Thank you for joining. Are there any questions?